The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the morning air of June 17, 1775, as Colonel William Prescott stood atop Reed's Hill, surveying the makeshift fortifications his men had constructed through the night. Below him, Boston Harbor sparkled deceptively peaceful in the early dawn light. But the British warships anchored there told a different story. Their cannons were already being loaded, and Prescott knew that within hours, this small patch of colonial soil would become a crucible of blood and determination. The previous evening had seen over 1,000 colonial militiamen creep silently across the Charlestown Peninsula under cover of darkness. What had begun as whispered orders in Cambridge had transformed into one of the most audacious military operations in the young rebellion's short history. The Continental Congress had only recently appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief, but news of his appointment had not yet reached these Massachusetts farmers-turned-soldiers, who now found themselves facing the might of the British Empire. According to historical accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, the original plan had called for fortifying Bunker Hill, the peninsula's highest point. However, in the confusion of the night march, the colonial forces had instead begun their earthworks on the lower, but more strategically positioned Breed's Hill, closer to Boston and well within range of British cannons. This fateful mistake would prove both costly and heroic. Prescott moved among his men, many of whom had never seen combat beyond skirmishes with British patrols. These were blacksmiths and farmers, shopkeepers and laborers, united by a growing conviction that their rights as Englishmen were being trampled by an increasingly tyrannical parliament. The intolerable acts of 1774 had pushed many beyond their breaking point, and the recent battles at Lexington and Concord had proven that armed resistance was not only possible, but necessary. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of drums echoed across Boston Harbor. British Major General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, had been awakened before dawn by reports of the colonial fortifications. From his headquarters, he could see the rebel earthworks clearly. Through his spyglass, a brazen challenge to British authority that could not go unanswered. The political implications were staggering. If a ragtag collection of colonial militia could fortify positions within cannon shot of Boston and hold them against professional British troops, the entire foundation of royal authority in America would crumble. The morning hours brought a flurry of British military activity. Ships positioned themselves for optimal bombardment angles while officers debated strategy. Brigadier General Robert Piggott argued for a direct frontal assault, believing that British bayonets and discipline would quickly scatter the amateur soldiers. Major General William Howe, recently arrived from England, favored a more methodical approach involving naval bombardment, followed by coordinated infantry attacks from multiple directions. Meanwhile, on Breed's Hill, colonial reinforcements continued to arrive throughout the morning. Captain Thomas Knowlton led his Connecticut Rangers into position, while the 8th General Israel Putnam, veteran of the French and Indian War, rode between the various colonial units, offering encouragement and tactical advice. The contrast between the professional British preparations visible across the water and the seemingly chaotic colonial arrangements could not have been more stark. Yet beneath the apparent disorder lay a grim determination. These men understood that they were not merely defending a hill, they were defending an idea, the notion that free men could govern themselves, that royal authority had limits, and that resistance to tyranny was not only justified but morally required. Had taken root in their hearts and minds. As British cannon began their preliminary bombardment, sending dirt and debris flying from the hastily constructed redoubt, the die was cast for one of the bloodiest encounters of the American Revolution. The first British cannonball struck the colonial earthworks at precisely 10:30 in the morning, sending a shower of dirt and splintered wood across the defenders' heads. Within moments, the harbor erupted in a symphony of destruction as HMS Lively, HMS Falcon, and HMS Somerset opened their broadsides against the rebel fortifications. The thunderous roar echoed off the surrounding hills, and civilians in nearby Cambridge could feel the ground tremble beneath their feet with each coordinated volley. Colonel Prescott walked calmly along the parapet as iron balls whistled overhead, his composed demeanor serving as a steadying influence on his increasingly nervous men. Many of these colonials had never experienced artillery bombardment, and the psychological impact was immediate and severe. Several militiamen threw down their muskets and fled toward the safety of Charlestown Neck, the narrow strip of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland. Prescott made no attempt to stop them. Better to fight with willing men than to rely on those whose hearts had already fled the field. The British naval bombardment, while impressive in its fury, proved largely ineffective against the colonial earthworks. The soft dirt absorbed much of the impact, and the elevation angle required for the ship's guns meant that most shots either fell short or sailed harmlessly overhead. However, the psychological warfare was having its intended effect. With each passing minute, more colonial soldiers abandoned their positions, streaming back across Charlestown Neck in growing numbers. General Artemas Ward, commanding the colonial forces from his headquarters in Cambridge, faced an agonizing decision. Reports reaching him painted an increasingly desperate picture, ammunition running dangerously low, men deserting in alarming numbers, and British preparations for a full-scale assault becoming more apparent by the hour. The prudent military decision would be to order a withdrawal while the colonial forces could still retreat in good order. Yet Ward understood the broader implications of such a withdrawal. To abandon the field without a fight would signal to both the British and colonial moderates that armed resistance was fueled. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Boston Gazette, the British military leadership was experiencing its own heated debates. General Gage favored a cautious approach, recognizing that heavy casualties among his professional soldiers would be difficult to replace. So far from England, the British Army in Boston numbered only about 6,000 men, and reinforcements would take months to arrive from Europe. However, political pressure from London demanded decisive action against what Parliament viewed as open rebellion. Major General Howe ultimately prevailed in the strategic discussions, proposing a two-pronged assault that would demonstrate British military superiority while minimizing casualties through superior tactics and firepower. The plan called for Brigadier General Piggott to lead a diversionary attack against the colonial left flank, while Howe himself would command the main assault. Against the redoubt on Breed's Hill, British confidence ran high. These were veteran soldiers who had served with distinction in European campaigns, facing what they perceived as undisciplined colonial amateurs. The British landing began shortly after noon, with approximately 2,100 soldiers disembarking at Moulton's Point, on the eastern shore of the Charlestown Peninsula. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. Scarlet-coated infantry forming into perfect lines, officers on horseback shouting commands, and the glint of sunlight on thousands of bayonets. The British military machine was displaying its full pageantry and power, a deliberate demonstration intended to intimidate the colonial defenders from their earthworks. The remaining colonial soldiers watched the British deployment with a mixture of awe and growing apprehension. Many had served in local militia units, but those experiences consisted primarily of training exercises and ceremonial duties. The professional precision of the British formations was unlike anything they had witnessed, and whispered conversations along the colonial lines reflected growing uncertainty about their chances of survival. Captain Knowlton's Connecticut Rangers, positioned on the colonial left flank, received orders to establish defensive positions behind a rail fence that ran down toward the Mystic River. Using hay and grass to fill the gaps between the rails, they created makeshift cover that would prove crucial in the coming battle. Meanwhile, Colonel John Stark's New Hampshire Regiment took position along the beach, where British flanking movements would be most likely to succeed. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test both the resolve of colonial resistance and the effectiveness of British military might. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield, both armies made their final preparations for what would become one of the bloodiest encounters in American military history. The British advance began at 3:15 in the afternoon, a spectacle of military precision that had intimidated enemies across Europe for generations. 2,000 red-coated soldiers moved forward in perfect formation, their bayonets glinting in the June sunlight, drums beating, the steady cadence that had accompanied British victories from Minden to Quebec. Major General Howe, resplendent in his dress uniform, rode at the head of the main column, his confidence in British superiority absolute and unshakable from the colonial earthworks. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Colonel Prescott moved among his remaining defenders, perhaps 400 men who had chosen to stay despite the overwhelming odds. His instructions were simple but crucial: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. This command, later attributed to various officers, but most likely originating from the practical necessity of conserving ammunition, would become one of the most famous quotes in American military history. The colonial ammunition shortage was becoming critical. Many soldiers had fewer than 15 rounds remaining, and no resupply was possible given the British control of the surrounding waters. Each shot would have to count, requiring the kind of marksmanship that had made American hunters legendary, but had never been tested against professional European infantry. The psychological pressure was enormous. These farmers and tradesmen were about to face soldiers who had defeated the armies of France and Spain, as documented in the personal diary of British Lieutenant John Waller of the Marines, later preserved in the British National Archives. The initial British confidence began to waver as they approached the colonial positions. The rebels remained invisible behind their earthworks, creating an eerie silence that contrasted sharply with the thunderous naval bombardment that had preceded the assault. Experienced soldiers recognized this ominous quiet. Disciplined enemies, who waited for the optimal moment to strike, were far more dangerous than those who fired wildly at long range. The British right wing, commanded by Brigadier General Piggott, faced the most formidable colonial defenses. The redoubt on Breed's Hill had been strengthened throughout the morning, with additional earthworks extending toward the Mystic River. However, the British left wing encountered unexpected resistance from Colonel Stark's New Hampshire regiment, positioned behind hastily constructed stone walls along the beach. Stark had carefully positioned his men to create interlocking fields of fire, turning the seemingly vulnerable flank into a deadly trap dot at 400 yards distance. Some nervous colonial soldiers began to raise their muskets, but veteran officers quickly ordered them to hold their fire. The British continued their methodical advance, maintaining perfect formation despite the difficult terrain of the peninsula. Their discipline was remarkable. Even as individual soldiers stumbled over rocks and uneven ground, the overall formation remained intact, a testament to years of professional training. The tension became almost unbearable as the distance closed to 300 yards, then 200. British officers began to shout encouragement to their men, anticipating the moment when colonial resistance would crumble before the sight of British bayonets. Many expected the rebels to break and run, as militia forces had done in previous colonial conflicts. The professional soldiers carried themselves with the confidence born of countless victories against European opponents. At 150 yards, Colonel Prescott gave the command that would echo through American history: fire! The colonial volley erupted like thunder, a coordinated blast of musket fire that struck the British front ranks. With devastating effectiveness, the American frontiersmen's marksmanship, honed by years of hunting in dense forests, proved deadly accurate at close range. British officers, easily identified by their elaborate uniforms and mounted positions, became primary targets. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the British advance. The front ranks seemed to dissolve as soldiers fell by the dozens. Their perfect formations suddenly transformed into chaos and confusion. Major General Howe's horse was shot from under him, and his aide-de-camp fell dead beside him. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, the unstoppable British military machine had been brought to a complete halt by a handful of colonial farmers. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. The British soldiers, accustomed to facing European enemies who fought according to established conventions, found themselves confronting an opponent who combined European discipline with American marksmanship. The colonials, meanwhile, experienced a surge of confidence that bordered on disbelief. They had stopped the British Empire's finest soldiers in their tracks. The British recoil from that first devastating volley was immediate and instinctive. Soldiers who had never retreated before European armies found themselves stumbling backward over their own wounded. The perfect formation shattered like glass against colonial marksmanship. Major General Howe, his uniform torn by musket balls and his face streaked with the blood of his fallen aide-de-camp, struggled to maintain control. As his carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos behind the colonial earthworks, the defenders worked frantically to reload their muskets, many using ramrods with trembling hands as the enormity of what they had accomplished began to sink in. Colonel Prescott moved among them, shouting encouragement and tactical instructions, but his own amazement was barely concealed. These were the same British soldiers who had conquered an empire, and they were retreating from a hastily constructed fort manned by colonial militia. The British officers, their professional pride stung by the unexpected resistance, began the difficult task of reforming their scattered companies. The wounded were dragged to safety while sergeants shouted orders at soldiers who seemed stunned by the ferocity of the colonial defense. Many of the British casualties were officers. deliberately targeted by American marksmen who understood that eliminating leadership would create maximum disruption in the enemy ranks, according to military dispatches later sent to London and preserved. In the War Office records, British casualties from the first assault exceeded 100 men killed or wounded, a staggering number for what was supposed to be a straightforward operation. Against amateur soldiers, the colonial losses, by contrast, were minimal. Perhaps a dozen men wounded by the preliminary bombardment, with no deaths during the initial exchange of fire. Brigadier General Pigot's assault on the colonial left flank had fared even worse than Howe's main attack. Colonel Stark's New Hampshire men, positioned behind their stone wall defenses, had waited until the British were within 50 yards before opening fire. The result was carnage on a scale that shocked even veteran soldiers. The beach became littered with scarlet-coated bodies, and Pigot himself barely escaped death when his horse was shot from under him. The sight of British retreat had an electrifying effect on colonial morale. Throughout the surrounding area, from Cambridge and the nearby hills, hundreds of spectators had gathered to watch what many expected to be the quick suppression of the rebellion. Instead, they witnessed the impossible. British professional soldiers running from American militia. Cheers erupted from the colonial observers, and church bells began ringing throughout the countryside to spread news of the unexpected victory. However, the celebration was premature. Major General Howe, despite his shock at the initial repulse, was far from defeated. A veteran of numerous European campaigns, he recognized that the colonial success had been achieved through surprise and superior defensive positions. Rather than any fundamental change in military capability, the British still possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and training. Within 30 minutes of the first retreat, British officers had restored order to their scattered companies. The wounded were evacuated to the ships in Boston Harbor, while fresh ammunition was distributed to the remaining soldiers. Howe made crucial tactical adjustments based on his painful first lesson. In American warfare, officers would be less conspicuous targets, and the assault would focus on the weakest points in the colonial defenses rather than attempting a broad frontal attack. The colonial defenders used the respite to address their own critical problems. Ammunition was running dangerously low, with many soldiers possessing fewer than 5 rounds. Messengers were dispatched to Cambridge requesting immediate resupply, but the British naval blockade made any significant reinforcement unlikely. More troubling still was the continued desertion of colonial soldiers, many of whom had been unnerved by the sight of British casualties and the certainty of renewed attack. Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the most prominent political leaders of the Massachusetts resistance, arrived during this lull to take his place in the ranks as a common soldier. His presence provided a tremendous boost to colonial morale, demonstrating that the wealthy and educated were willing to risk their lives alongside common farmers and laborers. Warren's medical knowledge also proved valuable as he helped treat the growing number of colonial wounded. The British second assault began forming at 4:30 in the afternoon, this time with modifications designed to exploit colonial weaknesses. Additional troops were brought from Boston, bringing British strength to nearly 3,000 men. The naval bombardment resumed with increased intensity, focusing on the colonial ammunition supplies and communication lines. Most ominously for the defenders, British forces began moving to cut off the escape route across Charlestown Neck, threatening to trap the entire colonial force on the peninsula. As the Scarlet Lines advanced once again across the blood-soaked ground, both armies understood that the second engagement would be decisive. The colonials had proven they could fight, but their resources were nearly exhausted. The British had absorbed a painful lesson, but their professional pride and military necessity demanded victory regardless of the cost. The British second assault commenced at 4:45 in the afternoon, displaying modifications born from their costly first encounter with colonial resistance. Major General Howe had stripped his men of their heavy packs and unnecessary equipment, recognizing that speed and mobility would prove more valuable than traditional parade ground precision. The officers had exchanged their elaborate dress uniforms for simpler field gear, making themselves less conspicuous targets for the deadly accurate American marksmen. This time, the British approached with grim determination rather than confident swagger. The soldiers had seen their comrades fall in the first assault, and any illusions about facing cowardly colonial militia had been shattered by the devastating volleys from the rebel earthworks. Yet their professional discipline held firm, and the reform companies advanced with a methodical precision. That had made British infantry fear to cross Europe. From the colonial positions, the approaching enemy appeared even more formidable than before. The British had learned from their mistakes, advancing in loose formations that presented fewer concentrated targets, while maintaining enough cohesion to deliver effective bayonet charges. More troubling still was the obvious improvement in British tactics. Supporting units were positioned to exploit any gaps in the colonial defenses, and the naval bombardment was more accurately targeted against suspected ammunition stores. Colonel Prescott moved among his remaining defenders with increasing urgency, knowing that many of his men were down to their last few rounds of ammunition. Messages to General Ward in Cambridge had produced promises of resupply, but no powder or shot had yet appeared. The colonel made the difficult decision to concentrate his remaining ammunition among his best marksmen, effectively reducing his defensive capability but ensuring that each shot would have maximum impact. The ammunition crisis was becoming catastrophic. Throughout the colonial positions, Captain Knowlton's Connecticut Rangers were reduced to searching the pockets of wounded British soldiers for cartridges, while Colonel Stark's New Hampshire regiment had begun melting down pewter buttons and buckles to create makeshift musket balls. Such expedients might sustain a few more volleys, but could not support prolonged resistance against a determined British assault. As documented in letters later published in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the British naval bombardment during the second assault proved far more effective than the initial barrage. HMS Somerset and HMS Falcon had adjusted their aim based on observations from the first attack, and their cannonballs were now striking the colonial earthworks with devastating accuracy. Several direct hits collapsed portions of the main redoubt, burying defenders under tons of dirt and timber. The British infantry assault struck the colonial lines at 5:15 in the afternoon, meeting resistance that was fierce but noticeably weakened from the first encounter. The rebels' ammunition shortage was becoming apparent as their rate of fire decreased significantly, allowing British soldiers to advance closer before encountering the murderous volleys that had stopped them earlier. Yet when the colonial muskets did speak, their effect remained deadly. British casualties continued to mount at an alarming rate. Brigadier General Pigot's assault on the colonial left flank achieved greater success during the second attack, primarily due to the defenders' depleted ammunition supplies. The stone wall that had provided such effective cover during the first British advance was now manned by soldiers with empty cartridge boxes. Reduced to throwing rocks and wielding their muskets as clubs, several sections of the wall were overrun before colonial reserves could plug the gaps. The turning point came when British forces succeeded in establishing a foothold on the colonial right flank, where the earthworks were weakest and ammunition shortages most severe. A company of British light infantry, led by a young lieutenant whose name would be lost to history, managed to reach the base of the redoubt itself before being driven back by desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The psychological impact was enormous. The British had proven they could reach the colonial positions. Dr. Joseph Warren, fighting as a common soldier despite his prominent political position, rallied a group of Massachusetts militiamen to counterattack the British breakthrough attempt. His leadership proved crucial in restoring the colonial defensive line, but the effort cost precious ammunition and irreplaceable manpower. Warren himself was wounded during the fighting, though he refused evacuation and continued to encourage the defenders around him. By 6 o'clock in the evening, both armies were approaching exhaustion. The British had suffered severe casualties in their second assault. Later estimates would suggest over 200 additional killed and wounded, but had succeeded in demonstrating that the colonial positions could be taken. The rebels, meanwhile, had proven their courage and determination beyond any doubt, yet faced the grim reality that their ammunition was virtually exhausted. The lull between the second and inevitable third British assault provided a brief respite for both armies to assess their situations. For the British, despite their heavy losses, victory seemed within reach. One more determined push should overwhelm defenders who could barely return fire. For the colonials, the choice was becoming stark: retreat while withdrawal was still possible, or face annihilation when their ammunition ran out completely. The stage was set for the final, climactic phase of a battle that had already exceeded all expectations for both its ferocity and its significance in the growing American rebellion. The third and final British assault began at 6:30 in the evening as the sun cast long shadows across the peninsula now littered with the debris of war. Major General Howe, his uniform stained with blood and dirt, had made the difficult decision to commit his remaining reserves to what would be either decisive victory or catastrophic defeat. Nearly 3,000 British soldiers formed for the attack, representing virtually every available man in the Boston garrison. The British approach this time was markedly different from their previous efforts, having learned the deadly cost of frontal assaults against prepared positions. Howe concentrated his forces against the weakest points in the colonial defenses, while using diversionary attacks to prevent the rebels from reinforcing their threatened sectors. The British soldiers advanced with bayonets fixed, knowing that hand-to-hand combat would neutralize the American advantage in marksmanship. Inside the colonial redoubt, Colonel Prescott faced the agonizing reality that his men were down to their final rounds of ammunition. Many defenders had no powder left at all, reduced to wielding their muskets as clubs or searching desperately for makeshift weapons among the debris of their fortifications. The colonel made his final dispositions, positioning his remaining effective fighters at the most critical points while preparing for what he knew would be a fighting withdrawal. The ammunition crisis had become absolute throughout the colonial positions. Captain Knowlton's Connecticut Rangers were sharing their last cartridges among the best marksmen, while Colonel Stark's New Hampshire regiment had exhausted even their improvised shot. Made from melted pewter, some militiamen had resorted to loading their muskets with nails and broken glass, desperate to contribute something to the defense of their positions. As recorded in the journal of British Captain George Harris, of the 5th Regiment of Foot, later housed in the Royal Military Academy archives, the final assault initially met less resistance than the previous two attacks. The colonial rate of fire had dropped to a mere fraction of its earlier intensity, allowing British soldiers to advance much closer to the rebel earthworks. Before encountering serious opposition, however, when the defenders did fire, their shots remained devastatingly accurate. The breakthrough came at the northwestern corner of the colonial redoubt, where a combination of British light infantry and grenadiers managed to scale the earthworks. Despite fierce resistance from the handful of defenders still possessing ammunition, hand-to-hand combat erupted immediately, with soldiers fighting with bayonets, musket butts, and even bare hands. The professional training of the British soldiers began to tell as they systematically cleared the colonial positions through close. Combat Dr. Joseph Warren, who had refused multiple opportunities to withdraw to safety, was struck down by a British musket ball as he helped organize the colonial retreat. His death represented not merely the loss of a brave soldier, but the fall of one of Massachusetts' most important political leaders, a man whose writings and speeches had helped inspire the resistance movement. His sacrifice would become a rallying cry for future American forces. The collapse of the main redoubt triggered a general colonial withdrawal toward Charlestown Neck, the narrow strip of land representing their only escape route. The retreat was conducted with remarkable discipline considering the circumstances, with veteran officers like Colonel Stark and Captain Knowlton organizing rearguard actions to protect the withdrawing militiamen. Many colonial soldiers who had fled during the earlier British bombardments now returned to help cover the withdrawal of their comrades. British pursuit of the retreating colonials was hampered by their own exhaustion and the continuing accurate fire from American rear guards. Many British officers had become casualties during the assault, creating confusion in the command structure just when decisive leadership was most needed. The professional soldiers had won their objective, but at such enormous cost that victory felt more like defeat. The final phase of the battle saw the British occupation of the abandoned colonial earthworks, now revealed to be far more sophisticated than initial intelligence had suggested. The rebels had constructed interlocking fields of fire, carefully planned ammunition storage areas, and multiple fallback positions that had maximized their defensive capabilities. The British began to understand why their professional soldiers had found the colonial militia so difficult to dislodge. As darkness fell over the Charlestown Peninsula, both armies began counting the cost of their encounter. British casualties were staggering, over 1,000 killed and wounded, including 92 officers, representing nearly half of their attacking force. Many of the dead were experienced non-commissioned officers whose knowledge and leadership would be impossible to replace. The colonial losses, while significant in absolute terms, were proportionally much later, perhaps 450 casualties, including the irreplaceable Dr. Warren. The British had technically won the Battle of Bunker Hill by capturing the contested ground, but the victory was Pyrrhic in the extreme. General Gage would later write to London that another such victory would ruin the British Army in America. The colonials, despite their tactical defeat, had achieved something far more valuable. They had proven that American militia could stand against professional European soldiers and inflict devastating casualties upon them. The political implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate military situation, transforming a local rebellion into a continental struggle for independence. The dawn of June 18, 1775, revealed the true cost of what would paradoxically become known as a British victory. Major General Howe stood amid the captured colonial earthworks, surveying a scene of devastation that would haunt him for the remainder of his military career. The ground was littered with the bodies of over 200 British soldiers, many of them irreplaceable veteran sergeants and corporals, whose experience had taken years to develop and could never be quickly restored. The casualty figures, when finally compiled and sent to London, would shock the British government and fundamentally alter their approach to the American rebellion. Of the approximately 2,400 British soldiers who had participated in the assault, over 1,000 had become casualties, a loss rate of more than 40% that exceeded anything experienced in major European battles. Among the officer corps, the devastation was even more severe, with 90 decommissioned officers killed or wounded, representing a catastrophic loss of military leadership. According to dispatches later published in the London Chronicle, the British medical services were overwhelmed by the unprecedented casualty figures. The ships in Boston Harbor were converted into floating hospitals, while every available surgeon in the city worked frantically to treat the wounded. Many soldiers who might have survived with proper medical attention died from lack of adequate treatment, further increasing the British losses from what was supposed to have been a routine operation against colonial militia. The colonial army, despite its tactical defeat, had achieved something that transformed the nature of the conflict throughout America. News of the battle spread rapidly through the 13 colonies, carried by express riders who emphasized not the British capture of the peninsula, but the enormous casualties inflicted upon professional European soldiers by American farmers and tradesmen. The psychological impact was immense. If Massachusetts militia could inflict such damage upon the British Army, then armed resistance was not only possible, but potentially successful. General George Washington, who had recently accepted appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, received news of the battle while traveling toward Boston to assume his command. The reports confirmed his belief that American soldiers, properly led and supplied, could match European professionals in combat effectiveness. However, the ammunition shortage that had ultimately doomed the colonial defense also highlighted the enormous logistical challenges facing any sustained military campaign against British forces. The political ramifications extended far beyond military considerations. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress received detailed accounts of the battle that strengthened the position of those advocating for complete independence rather than reconciliation with Britain. The enormous British casualties demonstrated that the conflict had moved far beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. Too much blood had been spilled for either side to consider compromise. Without achieving decisive military victory, King George III and his ministers in London faced their own difficult recalculations. Following news of the battle, the easy suppression of colonial rebellion that had been confidently predicted by military advisors was clearly impossible given the resistance demonstrated at Bunker Hill. British strategy would need to shift from simple police actions to full-scale military campaigns, requiring enormous resources and thousands of additional troops that would strain the empire's finances and military capabilities. The human cost of the battle extended beyond the immediate casualties to families throughout both armies. British widows in England would receive news of husbands killed in what they had been told was a minor colonial disturbance, while American families mourned sons and fathers who had given their lives for principles that many still struggled to articulate. Dr. Warren's death, in particular, deprived the independence movement of one of its most articulate and inspiring leaders. The tactical lessons learned at Bunker Hill would influence military operations. Throughout the Revolutionary War, British commanders became far more cautious about frontal assaults against prepared American positions, while colonial leaders gained confidence in their ability to stand against professional European soldiers when fighting from defensive positions. The battle established patterns of warfare that would characterize the conflict for the next 8 years. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Bunker Hill demonstrated that the American Revolution would be far more than a political dispute. It would be a brutal military struggle requiring enormous sacrifices from both sides. The blood spilled on that June afternoon in 1775 had made compromise impossible and transformed a colonial rebellion into a war for national independence. The British had won their objective, but lost something far more valuable: the illusion that American resistance could be easily crushed. The colonials had lost the battlefield, but gained something precious beyond measure: the knowledge that they could fight and die as bravely as any soldiers in the world. From that realization would grow a nation founded on the principle that liberty was worth any price, including the ultimate sacrifice demonstrated by the defenders of Breed's Hill. On that bloody day in American history,